Gerald reads my name last and only to say it isn't there. To my son, Trent Calloway, I bequeath the entirety of the real estate portfolio, including the Ashford office complex, the Marlowe rental properties, and the family compound on Birch Hill. He pauses, adjusts his glasses, and does not look at me. To my wife, Diane Calloway, I bequeath all remaining liquid assets, including but not limited to... He keeps going. I stop listening to the words and start listening to the room instead. Diane's chair creaks as she leans back satisfied. A woman finally collecting on an investment she's been quietly making for a decade. Trent's knee is bouncing under the table fast, the way it used to when we were kids and he'd gotten away with something. Across from me, my father's chair sits empty at the head of the table, because my father is 3 weeks in the ground and can no longer sit anywhere. Gerald finishes. He sets the papers down and folds his hands and finally looks at me, and there's something almost like an apology in his face, which is worse than if there weren't. Wren, he says, I'm sorry. There's nothing here for you. I have heard those exact words before. I have heard them in this exact room, at this exact table, with this exact light coming in low and gold through the west windows, because Diane always insists on scheduling these things for 4 p.m. So the room looks warm and generous right when it's being at its cruelest. I have sat in this chair before, in this body, and heard Gerald say there's nothing here for you, and I have felt the floor of my life fall out from under me so completely that it took me most of a decade to find the bottom. I know exactly what happens next if I let it. Diane will offer me a check for my trouble, phrased just so that it sounds like a kindness rather than a payoff to make the family lawyer's paperwork airtight against a future contest. Trent will make some crack about how I should be relieved, really, given how much work managing property actually is. I will go home and cry until I have nothing left, and then I will spend the next several years watching the two of them run my father's life's work into rubble while pretending, at every holiday, that I chose this, that I walked away, that I never wanted any of it. I know this because I have lived it once already. I died at 34, on an iced-over sidewalk outside a foreclosure office, 3 days after signing paperwork to give up an apartment I could no longer afford, and I remember opening my eyes not into whatever comes after, but into this. Into my own 24-year-old hands, folded in my lap at this table, into this exact moment, 10 years early, with everything that's about to happen already fully lived and filed away inside me like a manual. Nobody else in this room knows exists. So when Gerald says there's nothing here for you, I don't cry. I smile. That's all right, I say, and my voice comes out so calm that Diane's head turns, just slightly, the way a person's does when something doesn't match the script they wrote. Thank you for your time, Gerald. I know this couldn't have been easy to put together. Trent laughs. A short, surprised bark of a laugh, because a decade from now, this is not how it goes, and some animal part of him already senses it. That's it? No waterworks? Should there be? I stand, smooth my skirt, and pick up my bag. It's Dad's money. He can do what he wants with it. Diane recovers fastest of the three of us, because Diane always does. We appreciate you being so understanding, Wren, she says, in the voice she uses for people she's already decided don't matter. Your father loved you very much, in his way. In his way. I could write a book about the weight she puts into those 2 words. I let it go. There will be time, so much time, for Diane to understand exactly how much I heard and how carefully I kept it. I leave before the check offer comes because I don't need it, and because letting Diane make the offer and watch me refuse it would tip my hand too early. I walk out of the house I grew up half visiting, into an early evening that smells like cut grass and the particular exhaust of Gerald's ancient Lincoln idling in the driveway. And I get into my own car, and I drive. I don't drive home. I drive north, out past the edge of town, along the frontage road that runs beside Route 9 until the strip malls thin out into gas stations and then into nothing at all. Just scrub grass and a chain link fence sagging around 11 acres of weeds and one collapsed equipment shed that everyone in my family, for as long as I can remember, has called the ditch. My father bought it decades ago for some reason he never fully explained. Some idea about frontage access that never went anywhere, and it sat there through my entire childhood as a punchline. Dad's folly, the ugliest asset in the portfolio. Diane used to say, at dinner with a little laugh, that she hoped he'd sell it before it embarrassed them at a dinner party. I pull onto the shoulder, And I sit there with the engine ticking, and I look at 11 acres of nothing. And for the first time since I opened my eyes in this decade, I really smile. Because I know something about this dirt that nobody else alive does. I know what it becomes. I know the date, almost to the week, when a transit authority 2 counties over will announce a regional rail expansion. And I know exactly which unremarkable stretch of frontage land along Route 9 gets chosen as the anchor site for the new hub. Because I read about it in a newspaper someone left on a bus seat, 2 years after I died the first time, with my own eviction papers still folded in my coat pocket, and I remember thinking, with the strange clarity you get when you have nothing left to lose, that of course it was that land. The ditch. The joke. Diane and Trent, in the life I already lived, held on to this land for years out of pure inertia and then panic sold it, along with 2 other marginal parcels, 18 months before the announcement, to shore up cash after Trent's disastrous attempt to flip the Ashford complex into luxury condos nearly bankrupted them. I remember the sale because I remember, with a bitterness that still had teeth even from a distance, reading about the buyer who scooped it up for almost nothing and then, less than 2 years later, sold access rights to the transit authority for more money than my father's entire real estate portfolio had been worth at the time of his death. They handed away a fortune because they never once in a decade of stewardship thought to look twice at 11 acres of weeds. I'm not going to make that mistake. I'm the one who's going to buy it. I don't cry on the drive home. I make a list. The version of me who lived through this decade the first time didn't understand for a long time that the humiliation wasn't a single event. It was a slow accumulation, so gradual you could almost mistake it for weather. Something that simply happened to you rather than something anyone did. It started small. I was 11 the year my father remarried, and Diane arrived in our lives already fully formed, already certain of the shape a family was supposed to take, and I simply wasn't in that shape. At the wedding, she introduced me to her side of the family as Robert's daughter. Never mine, never ours, just his. A fact attached to him the way a scar is attached to a person. Evidence of something that happened before she got there and couldn't be helped now. I didn't understand at 11 that this was the whole architecture of what was coming. I thought it was just how grown-ups talked. By 13, Trent had a room bigger than mine in the house Diane redecorated top to bottom the year they married. And my room, which used to be my mother's old sewing room before my mother died and before my father remarried, got repainted a shade. Diane called guest neutral, a phrase I didn't understand the weight of until years later. Sitting in a lawyer's office being told there was nothing here for me and thinking absurdly of a paint chip. By 16, I'd learned not to ask for things at the same time Trent asked for things, because whatever he asked for arrived faster, arrived warmer, arrived without the faint performance of consideration that always preceded anything given to me. New skates. A car for his 17th birthday, while I took the bus to school through my entire adolescence because Diane felt and said in front of me that some children are more responsible with big gifts than others. A sentence that told me everything about which child she meant without ever naming me directly. By 20, I'd stopped expecting warmth and started aiming, instead, for invisibility, on the theory that if I couldn't be loved as much as Trent, I could at least avoid being resented as much as I sometimes was. It didn't work. Diane found new shapes for the same message. At my college graduation, my father paid for the ceremony brunch, a modest affair at a mid-tier restaurant near campus because Diane had declared, with a regretful little laugh, that the good caterer was already booked for Trent's business school send-off the same weekend, an obvious lie nobody bothered contesting. She gave a toast that managed in 90 seconds to mention Trent's acceptance into his MBA program 4 separate times. By 28, 2 years before the will reading that ended my first life, I'd started keeping a private list in my head, an inventory of every small cruelty. Not because I intended to do anything with it, but because some part of me needed proof. Later that I hadn't imagined any of it. A Christmas where Diane handed me an envelope of cash for whatever you need, in front of a room of her friends, the same gesture she'd make toward a caterer's tip, while Trent got a car. A birthday where my father, softening under Diane's management even then, forgot to call, and Diane, when I mentioned it lightly the next week, said only that he'd been very tired lately, a phrase that would come to mean, over the following years, every excuse she needed for why his attention drifted the direction she steered it. The The first will reading, the one I lived through and died carrying the memory of, wasn't a single wound. It was the last stitch in a garment that had been sewn, one small careless cruelty at a time, over 24 years. That's what I understood, finally, standing on an iced sidewalk with an eviction notice in my coat pocket 3 days before I died. That I had spent my whole life being taught in 1,000 small increments that I did not count. And then I had been surprised, genuinely surprised, when the largest document of my father's life confirmed it in writing. After that reading, the first time, I didn't leave the way I left this time. I remember it in pieces. The way you remember things you've spent years trying not to remember. I remember begging, actually begging, saying there must be some mistake. Surely Dad meant to include something. Surely Gerald could check again. And I remember Trent laughing before Diane could even compose her face into sympathy. And I remember a security guard. Diane had one on retainer for the house, ostensibly for estate matters. Though I understood even then, it was mostly theater. Walking me to my car with a hand not quite touching my elbow, guiding without contact, the particular humiliation of being handled like a problem rather than a person. I remember the years after in fragments too. A studio apartment that kept getting smaller as rent kept climbing. A job in an office where nobody knew my last name meant anything, which was its own kind of relief and its own kind of grief. A slow drift away from any of the family friends who might have asked too many questions about why the Calloway girl was waiting tables some weekends to cover a gap in rent. I remember 3 different landlords over 6 years. Each move a small failure I didn't tell anyone about. Each apartment a little further from anything resembling the life I'd been raised to expect. I remember near the end, sitting across from a foreclosure counselor who kept using the word options in a tone that made clear there weren't any left worth having, and signing paperwork that gave up an apartment I'd fought 2 years to keep, and walking out into a February that had turned the sidewalk to glass without my noticing, because I was too busy trying not to cry in public to watch my feet. I don't remember the fall itself, not really. I remember the cold. I remember, oddly, a discarded newspaper blowing past me on the sidewalk before I went down, snagging for a second against a mailbox, a headline about a transit hub I didn't read closely enough at the time to understand what it meant. I remember thinking, in the strange, slow motion of falling, that I hoped whoever found me wouldn't have to wait long in the cold. I don't remember dying. I remember waking up. I write down everything I remember. Not for revenge, not exactly, and/or not only that, but because information this time is the only inheritance I actually have, and I intend to spend every scrap of it. The version of me who died the first time spent years grieving the wrong thing. I mourned the money, mourned the house, mourned the idea that my father, somewhere behind Diane's careful management of his last years, might have wanted to leave me something and simply never gotten the chance to say so before his mind started slipping, and his hand started shaking too badly to sign anything Gerald put in front of him that Diane hadn't approved first. What I understand now, sitting on my own second-hand couch with a legal pad and a pen, is that grief was never going to buy me anything. Information would. I spend the next several weeks doing quiet, unglamorous things. I look up the actual county records on the Route 9 parcel. My father's name is still on the deed, technically part of the estate now passing to Trent. But Gerald's language in the will was sloppy in a way I remember precisely because it caused problems the first time around too. The real estate portfolio bequeathed to Trent was itemized by name, Ashford, Marlow, Birch Hill, and the Route 9 land wasn't listed. It falls by omission into the residuary clause which sweeps unnamed assets to Diane. I remember this because I remember the argument Trent and Diane had about it, years from now. A screaming match in a kitchen I am not currently welcome in, over whose fault it was that nobody caught the gap before the sale. I know something else too. Diane doesn't want it. She has never wanted it. To Diane, the ditch isn't an asset. It's an eyesore attached to her late husband's poor judgment. A thing she'd be relieved to be rid of the moment it's convenient. Which means if I want it, I don't need to fight Trent for it. I need to be patient. And I need to be the buyer Diane doesn't think twice about. I set up an LLC. It costs me almost nothing and takes an afternoon. Marrow Holdings, a name I pick because it sounds like 100 boring companies and belongs to none of them. No trace of Calloway in it anywhere. I use what's left of my savings. plus a modest loan I qualify for because my credit this time around has 10 fewer years of desperate late payments dragging it down. I don't buy the land from Diane directly. Not yet. She doesn't even own it clean yet. Probate takes time. But I do the groundwork. I get pre-approved. I find the surveyor who will eventually confirm the parcel boundaries for the transit authority years from now, and I quietly, casually strike up an acquaintance with him at a county planning meeting. I have no obvious reason to attend except that I remember his name from a footnote in an article I read the first time I lived through this decade. His name is Marcus Oyalaran, and the first time I meet him, he's standing near the coffee urn at the back of a county planning meeting. Nobody under 60 attends voluntarily, looking like a man who'd rather be anywhere else. I strike up a conversation about zoning overlays of all things, because I remember, barely from a line in that same discarded newspaper article, that he'll eventually be the one who surveys the Route 9 corridor for the Transit Authority's environmental review. I don't need anything from him yet. I just need him to remember me, years from now, as a woman who once asked an unusually sharp question about frontage easements at a meeting where nobody else was paying attention. People remember being taken seriously. It costs nothing to plant that now and collect on it later. I also spend those early months learning the difference between what I remember and what I merely think I remember because the two aren't the same thing. And confusing them would be its own kind of disaster. I don't recall exact dollar figures from the first life, not precisely. Grief and poverty have a way of blurring numbers even when they sharpen dates, so I don't build my plan around a specific price I expect the transit authority to pay. I build it around the two things I'm certain of. The location, because 11 acres of collapsing shed and chain link fence is not a detail a person forgets, even from a distance of a decade and a death. And the timing, because I remember the season the announcement broke, the particular slant of early spring light in the photograph the article ran alongside its headline. Everything else and the exact structure of the deal, the exact leverage I'll need, I have to build myself the same as anyone would, except I get to build it years ahead of the deadline instead of scrambling after the fact. I am building a version of myself that nobody in my family will recognize as dangerous. Because dangerous to them looks like a lawyer or a rival developer. It does not look like the stepdaughter they've already decided is soft. 6 months after the funeral, probate closes. Diane inherits the residuary estate. The Route 9 parcel included, exactly as I remembered. 4 months after that, at a Sunday dinner I attend because not attending would be its own kind of tell, Diane brings it up herself, exactly the way I knew she would, because some patterns don't need a decade of hindsight to predict. Some patterns are just Diane. I keep meaning to unload that dreadful strip of land your father was so attached to, she says, cutting her chicken into pieces smaller than necessary. It's a liability, frankly. Weeds, that collapsing shed. I had someone tell me a raccoon's probably living in it. I don't know why he never sold it. Sentimental, I guess, I say. Sentimental doesn't pay the property taxes on it, Trent says, not looking up from his phone. I let a pause sit there just long enough to look like I'm working up the nerve to say something foolish. I'll take it off your hands if you want, I say finally. I mean, not for anything. Just, it was his. I'd rather it not go to some stranger who bulldozes the shed and puts up a billboard. Diane's eyebrows go up, delighted and faintly condescending in the way she gets when she thinks she's found the easiest transaction of her week. You want to buy the ditch. I want to buy Dad's ditch, I say, and let my voice catch just a little on Dad's, because performing grief when you no longer feel it raw is its own kind of skill, and I have had a decade of practice at knowing exactly which notes land. It's not like I want the Ashford building, Diane. I just don't want it to be a stranger's. Trent actually laughs, delighted at my apparent foolishness. God, that's so you, Wren. You want to spend real money on swampland because it makes you feel close to Dad. Let her, Diane says, already moving on, already thinking about something else the way people do when they believe they've correctly identified the least important object in the room. Honestly, it'll save me the hassle of listing it. Have Gerald draw something up. Market rate, obviously. I'm not giving it away. A beat, and then, because Diane never resists twisting a knife she's already decided is harmless. It's sweet, really. It's the only piece of this whole business you're going to end up with. And it's the piece nobody else wanted. I look down at my plate so she can't see my face. That's okay, I say. I don't need much. I pay market rate for 11 acres of weeds. Which, because nobody has looked at that land with fresh eyes in 30 years, because the assessor's valuation hasn't moved with anything but inflation, because Diane wants it gone more than she wants top dollar, comes to a number that would make a person from my first life weep with relief. I signed the papers under Marrow Holdings, and Gerald, drawing up the transfer for Diane, doesn't so much as blink at the LLC name because why would he? It's the ditch. It's a joke asset changing hands between a joke buyer and a woman who's glad to be done with it. For the next several years, I let myself be exactly who they expect me to be. This is the hardest part, harder than I remembered. Because knowing something is a performance doesn't make it painless to perform. I show up to every holiday. I sit at the far end of tables I used to think. As a child, I might one day sit closer to the middle of. I let Diane introduce me. At a dinner party I'm invited to, mostly so the guest list looks properly blended. As my husband's daughter from his first marriage, to a room full of people who then all do the small, polite recalibration of who I must be and how much I must matter. I let Trent talk over me about real estate strategy as if I've never once had an original thought about property in my life. And I nod and I ask questions that make him feel smart, because every time Trent feels smart around me, he gets looser with information he shouldn't be sharing. It's through exactly this looseness that I learn, 2 years in, that Trent has decided the Birch Hill compound's real value isn't the house at all, and it's the 14 acres around it, half of which border my 11, and that he's begun quietly courting a regional developer about turning the whole stretch into a mixed-use retail corridor once some annoying zoning stuff clears up. He tells me this over drinks at Diane's 40th anniversary party. She remarried the anniversary date to her wedding with my father, as if that erases the fact that my mother existed first, which is its own quiet cruelty I've stopped letting myself feel anything about. And he tells it to me because he's had 3 drinks, and because he still, after everything, believes I am not a person worth being careful around. The play, he says, leaning against the bar, is we control everything from the highway all the way back to the ridge. Continuous frontage. That's where the real money is. Not in some tenant renewing a lease for another 18 months. You gotta think like a developer, Wren, not like... He gestures at me, a little loose, a little cruel. Like somebody who inherited a hobby. I didn't inherit anything. I say, mild. Remember? He winces briefly, the closest thing to guilt I ever see cross his face in either life, and covers it with another sip of his drink. Right, well, lucky you, dodging the headache. I don't tell him that continuous frontage from the highway to the ridge runs directly through the 11 acres he doesn't know I own. I let him keep believing the corridor he's imagining is buildable exactly as he pictures it. I let him spend 2 more years, and, eventually, a great deal of his mother's liquid inheritance courting investors on the strength of a redevelopment plan that has a hole in the middle of it, shaped exactly like my father's ditch. I don't do this out of cruelty, or not only that. I do it because I remember, with total clarity, that in my first life, this exact plan is the thing that finally breaks them. Not the will, not the estate, but their own greed, aimed at a target they never once thought to check whether they actually controlled. There are other small things I do in those years that feel less like strategy and more like quiet insurance. I never let my ownership of Marrow Holdings surface anywhere Diane or Trent might casually stumble across it. I keep my own name off every filing that doesn't legally require it. And where it does, the initial LLC registration, buried in a state database nobody in my family has ever had reason to search, I make sure the listed address is a P.O. box 2 towns over rather than my apartment. I open a separate bank account for Marrow's operating funds at a credit union. Diane wouldn't set foot in if you paid her, because Diane has always been the kind of woman who judges an institution by the marble in its lobby. And this one doesn't have any. Small, boring precautions. The kind that don't look like anything until they're the reason nobody catches you early enough to stop you. I let Diane manage what's left of my presence in the family the way she's always managed it. Carefully, at arm's length, in a way designed to remind everyone, including me, exactly where I sit in the order of things. I'm invited to Thanksgiving, but seated near the far end of the table, past the cousins twice removed who only visit for the food. I'm asked to help set up for the annual holiday party, which Diane frames as trusting me with something important and which actually means 3 hours of unpaid labor arranging chairs before the guests she actually wants to impress arrive. I attend Trent's engagement party. He marries young, this time around too, a woman named Sloan who works in wealth management and who looks at me the one time we're introduced with the particular blankness of someone who's been told a 5-second version of my story and has already decided it isn't interesting, and I smile through a toast that mentions everyone at the table except me by name. None of it costs me anything anymore, not really. Or it costs me less than it used to, because I know something they don't. That every single one of these small diminishments is temporary. A debt accruing interest I intend to collect on in full. There's a strange private discipline to it, holding two truths in your head at once. The humiliation, real and present and occasionally still capable of stinging in the old places, and the certainty, absolute and load-bearing, that none of it will matter in the end. I get better at holding both truths the longer I practice. I also, in those years, build something that has nothing to do with revenge at all. Marrow Holdings starts small. The Route 9 parcel is its only asset for the first 2 years. But I don't let it stay small out of caution. I use the equity in the land as collateral for a modest second acquisition. A rundown 4-unit rental building on the edge of downtown that nobody wants because the roof needs work and the previous owner let the whole thing slide into disrepair rather than maintain it properly. I fix the roof. I find good tenants. I learn in the unglamorous, hands-on way that no inheritance ever would have taught me what it actually takes to run a property well, rather than simply own one, which pipes fail first in an old building, which contractors overcharge, and which ones are worth the extra hour of driving to reach. How to read a lease for the clause a bad tenant will try to exploit. By the time the will reading comes around the second time, Marrow Holdings isn't just a shell built around a secret. It's a small, real, functioning business that I built with my own hands and my own judgment. And that part of it, the part that has nothing to do with Diane or Trent or what they took from me, turns out to matter to me more than I expected it to. The only person who knows the full shape of the plan in those years is Nadia, a friend from the 4-unit building's second tenant meeting who becomes something closer to family than anyone with my actual last name ever managed to. She's a contractor, sharp-tongued and unbothered by wealth or its absence, and she's the one who helps me source the roof repair at a fair price when every other quote came in padded for a woman who looked, to the men giving the quotes, like she didn't know what a shingle cost. I don't tell her everything, not the rebirth, not the decade I've already lived through once, because there's no way to say that sentence out loud and have anyone believe you, not even someone who loves you. But I tell her enough, that my family cut me out of everything, that I bought a piece of land nobody wanted on purpose, that I know somehow that it's going to matter more than any of them understand. How do you know? She asks me once over coffee in my kitchen, the same question anyone would ask, the reasonable one. I just do, I say, which isn't an answer, and she lets it not be one, because that's the kind of friend she is, willing to believe I know something I can't explain, simply because I've never given her a reason not to trust my judgment about anything else. Well, she says, after a while, stirring her coffee, for what it's worth, I hope you're right. Because watching you sit through those dinners, smiling at people who clearly think you're an afterthought, that's been hard to watch, even secondhand. It won't be forever. I tell her, and for the first time in a long time, saying it out loud to someone else makes it feel more solid than it did just living inside my own head. She's the one I call the night after the will reading the second time. The actual reading, the one where I already know every word before Gerald says it. She doesn't ask why I sound so calm. She just says, "You want me to come over, or you want to be alone with it?" And I tell her I want company, and she comes, and we don't talk about the will at all. We just sit on my couch and watch something forgettable on television. And it's the first time in either of my lives that being cut out of something has felt, in the moment, less like a wound and more like a formality I was already prepared for. There's a version of this decade I could tell you that's only strategy, only spreadsheets, and quiet phone calls and patient, bloodless positioning. That's not the whole truth. And I don't want to give you a story with all the grief filed off, because the grief is real, even when the plan is working. My father, in this second life, lasts 3 years longer than he did in the first, because I know things this time that let me intervene in small, deniable ways. I mention at a dinner a specialist I read about who turns out to catch something Diane's chosen doctor missed for a full year the first time around. I can't fix what's happening to him. I can only slow it, buy him a little more clear-headed time, and I take every hour of it I can get. It isn't easy getting Diane to agree to the second opinion. She's built her whole management of my father's decline around a particular doctor, an old family friend of hers from before she married my father, whose bedside manner is smooth and reassuring in exactly the way that keeps a worried family from asking too many hard questions. And I understand, watching her, that some part of the arrangement suits her. A diagnosis she can control the pace of, delivered by someone she trusts to deliver it gently, is easier to live inside than one that might demand more of her than she wants to give. I don't say any of this to her directly. I simply mention over a holiday dinner, in the mildest voice I can manage, an article I claim to have read about a specialist 2 hours away who's had unusual success with cases like my father's, phrased so carefully as an idle, half-formed suggestion that Diane can dismiss it without losing face if she wants to. She doesn't dismiss it. Not entirely. My father, still lucid enough at that point to have opinions of his own, likes the idea. And Diane, unwilling to be the one who visibly stood in the way of her husband getting a second opinion in front of witnesses, agrees to the appointment more out of social pressure than conviction. The specialist catches something the first doctor missed. Nothing that changes the ultimate outcome, I already know that much, but something that buys clearer months, better months, a longer stretch of my father still being fully himself before the fog sets in for good. I don't take credit for it. I let Diane believe it was her idea to seek the second opinion because I don't need credit. I need time. And I get some. There's a stretch of maybe a year and a half in the middle of all this where my father is sharper than he's been, in the version of this decade I remember, and I use it. I come by more than I did the first time. More than Diane particularly likes, though she never says so outright. Just arranges things so my visits often land when she's unfortunately tied up and can't be there to supervise them. I don't mind. Those are the visits I want most anyway. We talk about things that have nothing to do with the estate, nothing to do with Diane or Trent, his own father, a man I never met, who ran a hardware store 2 towns over and taught my father everything he knew about property by having him walk the aisles, restocking shelves before he was old enough to drive. My father tells me one afternoon that the Route 9 parcel was the first piece of land he ever bought entirely on his own instinct, without a partner or an appraisal telling him it made sense, and that he never sold it. Through 30 years of Diane's gentle suggestions that he should, because some part of him liked owning one thing nobody else understood the value of. Your grandfather used to say the best deals look like mistakes to everyone, but the person making them, he tells me that afternoon. And I have to look away for a second. Because I know exactly how true that's about to become, and I can't explain to him why the sentence lands as hard as it does. There's an afternoon, maybe 8 months before the end, when Diane is out, and I've come by under the excuse of dropping off groceries she didn't ask for, and I find him in the sunroom, more lucid than he's been in weeks, looking out at the garden like he's trying to memorize it. "You don't come around here much anymore," he says without turning. "Or you do, and I don't remember it. Hard to tell these days which one it is." "I come around," I say, and sit near him, not too close. "You just don't always know it's me." He looks at me sideways, something sharp surfacing through the fog that's been thickening over him for years. "I know it's you right now." I don't say anything, because I'm afraid of what will come out if I try. "I did you wrong," he says, plain, like it's a fact about the weather. I let her manage things. I let her manage me, if I'm honest, because it was easier than fighting, and I told myself you were strong enough not to need me to fight for you. That was a coward's math. I want you to know I see that some days, not all of them, today. "You don't have to." "I know I don't have to," he says. "I'm doing it because I want to while I still can. Whatever's in that will, whatever she's had Gerald write, that document was never going to be the truth of it. You understand? The truth of it is, you were the only one of the 3 of you who ever came to sit with me because you wanted to, not because you were counting something. I think about 11 acres of weeds sitting in an LLC with my thumbprint on the paperwork, and for one unsteady second, I feel like a fraud. Like even this quiet moment has a counting house ledger running underneath it that he'd be disgusted by if he knew. But then I think about the years I actually spent in my first life, aching for exactly one sentence like this and never getting it, dying with the hole that sentence would have filled still wide open in me, and I let myself just be his daughter in a sunroom for however much longer that's allowed to last. "I love you," I tell him, and mean it uncomplicated by anything else, for the length of that one sentence. "I know," he says. "I always knew." I just wasn't brave enough to say the rest of it out loud where she could hear. He dies 5 months later. I am the one who found comfort, if not peace, in knowing that whatever comes next in this house, he at least left this world having told me the truth once, on a day he was clear enough to mean it. The will reading, the second time I sit through it, is a formality. I know every word before Gerald says it. I know Diane's face will do the thing it does, satisfied and smooth. I know Trent's knee will bounce. I know I will smile and say that's all right and mean something entirely different by it than anyone in the room understands. What I don't fully appreciate until I'm actually living it is how much steadier it feels the second time around. Not because the hurt is gone, but because I finally know what it's in service of. To my son, Trent Calloway, I bequeath the entirety of the real estate portfolio, Gerald reads. And I watch Trent's face arrange itself into satisfaction. The exact expression he wore 2 lifetimes and 1 lifetime ago. And I think about 14 acres at Birch Hill with a hole in the middle of them that he doesn't know is there yet. To my wife, Diane Calloway, I bequeath all remaining liquid assets. Gerald continues, and Diane's chair creaks the same creak. And I think about how liquid a portfolio can look on paper, and how quickly that can change once the paper meets the ground. When he finishes, he looks at me with the same almost apology. Wren, I'm sorry, there's nothing here for you. That's all right, I say. And this time, I don't have to work at the Calm because I own the only piece of ground on this entire estate whose value neither of them has bothered to look at twice. Thank you for your time, Gerald. Diane offers the check for my trouble. I take it this time. A small, telling difference from the first life because refusing it would be its own kind of tell, and because I don't need the money badly enough anymore to care about the insult folded into it. I fold the check into my bag with a polite thank you and I leave before the light through the west windows goes from gold to gray, and I drive north, out past the strip malls, to 11 acres of weeds that are worth, at this exact moment, more than the entire rest of the estate Gerald just read aloud. And nobody in that room knows it but me. It takes 14 months from the will reading for the pieces to fall the way I remember them falling. Trent, freed from having to run anything past his father and only nominally checked by Diane, moves fast on the Birch Hill plan. Faster than he did the first time, if anything, because grief makes people reckless in exactly the direction their appetites already point. And Trent's appetite has always pointed toward being seen as the man who finally did something big with the Calloway name. He brings in the regional developer he'd been courting for years, a firm called Kestrel Group that specializes in exactly this kind of highway corridor retail build-out, and together they draw up renderings, actual renderings, glossy ones, the kind you put on an easel at an investor dinner, for a continuous commercial strip running from the Route 9 exit ramp all the way back to the Birch Hill Ridge. The renderings include my 11 acres. Of course they do. On paper. In the county plat maps Trent and his lawyers are working from, it's still marked out of habit and laziness under its old informal name, the Calloway parcel, because nobody at Kestrel has bothered to run a fresh title search before committing money to renderings. And Trent has never once in either lifetime been the kind of man who checks his own homework. I find out about the investor dinner from Diane, who invites me. Not out of warmth, I understand, but because excluding me entirely might look to the small circle of people who still remember I exist like something worth gossiping about. I go. I wear something forgettable. The dinner is held in a private room at a downtown hotel. All white tablecloths and a slideshow projected onto a screen at the front. And this is a bigger production than the loose bar-side confession Trent gave me years earlier at his mother's anniversary party. This time, there are 20 investors in the room, catering staff circling with hors d'oeuvres, a string quartet in the corner that nobody's actually listening to. I stand near the back, near the open bar, holding a glass of wine I mostly don't drink, while Trent gives a full formal presentation, polished now, professionally produced, full of words like synergy and footprint and gateway parcel, gesturing at a rendering of a shopping corridor, anchor tenant, boutique retail, a promenade with string lights in the illustration, the kind of image a graphic designer builds to make a parking lot look like a vacation. The corridor concept, he says, clicking to the next slide, is about continuity. Investors love continuity. You don't want gaps in a retail experience. Gaps break the flow. Gaps means somebody has to get back in their car, and once somebody's back in their car, you've lost them to the next town over. What we've assembled here, He gestures at the rendering at the long, uninterrupted stretch of frontage running from the highway exit all the way back toward the ridge. Is uninterrupted. Highway to hilltop. No gaps. I count from the back of the room exactly how many of the assembled investors nod along without once asking who holds title to every parcel in that uninterrupted stretch. All of them. Every single one, nodding at a slide built on land that includes, unlabeled and unremarked upon, 11 acres that belong to a woman standing 3 feet from the open bar. Sipping wine she isn't really drinking, saying nothing. Afterward, at the bar, Trent finds me flushed with the particular high of having just performed confidence in front of people whose money he wants. "So, what'd you think?" he asks. And there's something almost boyish in the way he asks it. An old, buried hope that even now, even after everything, I might be the one person in the family who'd tell him honestly if it was good. "It's ambitious," I say, which is true, and lets him hear it however he wants to. Kestrel thinks we can break ground in 18 months, 2, worst case. He signals the bartender for another. "This is the one, Wren. This is the thing that finally makes people stop saying Robert's son and start saying Trent Calloway. That'd be nice for you," I say, and mean it more sincerely than he'll ever know because I already understand exactly how the sentence is going to age. 6 weeks later, the Transit Authority makes its announcement. I don't need to read about it in a discarded newspaper this time. I read about it live at my kitchen table on a Tuesday morning, in a press release that names the anchor site for a new regional rail hub as an underutilized parcel along the Route 9 corridor, ideal for its proximity to the existing highway interchange and its available acreage for platform and parking infrastructure. They don't name the exact parcel in the release. They don't have to. I already know. The call from Trent comes 4 days later, and I let it go to voicemail twice before I pick up, because making him wait is its own small, deliberate cruelty. The same coin he spent on me for a decade, and I've decided I'm allowed to spend a little of it back. "Wren." His voice has a strain in it, I recognize. Not panic yet, but the beginning of it. The sound of a man who's just found out the numbers in his head don't match the numbers on the page. "Hey, so this is kind of a weird question, but the Route 9 land, the old parcel, Dad's land, whatever happened with that exactly? After the estate stuff, I bought it," I say. "You remember. You made fun of me for it." A long pause. "Right. No, I remember. Kestrel's people are asking about title on the corridor parcels, and there's some kind of gap in the chain, and I told them it wasn't a big deal. It's just the ditch. It's probably still folded into the residuary or whatever, but they're saying the county records show a transfer to some LLC a few years back, and I need you to tell me that's not actually a problem, right? That's just paperwork, right?" I let the silence stretch long enough that he has to say my name again before I answer. "It's not a problem for me," I say. There's a long silence on the line, long enough that I can hear, faintly, someone else in the room with him. Sloan, probably, asking what's wrong in the particular hushed tone people use when they can tell something is wrong, but not yet how badly. "What does that mean?" Trent says finally, and the strain has curdled into something flatter. More careful, the sound of a man doing math he doesn't like the answer to. "Wren, what does that mean?" "It means the land's mine," I say. "It has been for years, you knew that. You made a joke about it actually more than once." That was a joke? That was you buying some sentimental garbage plot that wasn't..." He stops himself, and I can hear him trying to reorganize the last several years of his own certainty into something that still makes sense. And failing. Kestrel needs an access easement across that parcel, or the whole corridor doesn't work. The entrance road runs right through it. You understand that, right? You have to understand that. "I understand it very well," I say. "So, what do you want?" "I want to talk about it properly," I say. "Not on the phone." "Set up a meeting. I'll bring my lawyer." "Your lawyer." He says it like the words taste strange in his mouth, like he's only now in this exact sentence, absorbing the fact that I have one, that I've had reason to for years, that there's an entire architecture of my life he's never once bothered to look at closely enough to notice. "Jesus, Wren, how long have you been sitting on this?" "Since before Dad died," I say, and let that land exactly as heavy as it's going to. "Set up the meeting, Trent." He does 3 days later, and in the interval I find out, through Priya, whose cousin's connections turn out to be more useful than I expected, that Kestrel's lawyers have already pulled the county records and found the transfer to Marrow Holdings, and that Trent's spent those 3 days on increasingly frantic calls, trying to figure out through back channels who's actually behind the LLC without success. Because I built it precisely so he wouldn't be able to. By the time we sit down, he already suspects it's me. He just doesn't have it confirmed. And some small, stubborn part of him is apparently still holding out hope that it isn't. That there's some other explanation, some other reason his sister would have registered a shell company in a county he's never once heard her mention that doesn't require him to reckon with the possibility that I've been sitting 3 feet away from his ambitions for years, watching and choosing not to warn him. The negotiation happens in Diane's living room, which is its own kind of symmetry I didn't plan but am not sorry for. The same room where I was once handed a check for my trouble, now hosting the conversation where the trouble finally becomes theirs. They've had 3 weeks to understand the shape of what's happened, which is enough time for Trent to stop hoping it's a misunderstanding and enough time for Diane to stop pretending she isn't frightened. Kestrel's lawyers have done what Trent should have done a decade ago and pulled a full title history on every parcel along the proposed corridor. And the news isn't just that I own the anchor site the transit authority wants, it's that without access, easements across my 11 acres, the entire continuous frontage concept Trent sold his investors on physically doesn't work. The retail corridor needs a shared entrance road. The shared entrance road needs my land. Kestrel has quietly started asking, through their lawyers, whether Trent actually has what he claimed he had. And Trent, for the first time in his life, does not have a smooth answer. Diane opens with warmth because Diane always opens with warmth, the same way a hand opens before it closes into something else. Wren, sweetheart, thank you for coming. We just want to talk this through as a family. We're not really a family, though, I say, pleasantly, sitting in the same chair I sat in for the will reading because I chose it on purpose. You've been telling me that in a dozen different ways since I was 24. I'm just agreeing with you now. Trent's jaw tightens. This isn't the time for what? Honesty? I think it's exactly the time. I set my bag down, unhurried. You want to talk about the corridor? Let's talk about the corridor. Diane tries again, softer. The guilt angle, which I remember her attempting the first time too. In a dozen smaller moments I let slide because I didn't yet understand what they cost me. We're family, whatever's happened. Your father would have wanted my father, I say, and something in my voice must land differently than she expects because she actually stops. Told me the last time he was lucid enough to mean it, that the will was never going to be the truth of anything. I've thought about that a lot the last few years. I think he was right. The will said there was nothing here for me, so as far as I understood it, I wasn't family. I was just watching. Nobody says anything for a moment. Here's what I'll offer, I say, because I did not come here to relitigate the past. I came here to close a deal. I'll grant Kestrel an access easement across my parcel, enough for the entrance road, enough to make your corridor buildable. I'm not interested in blocking the project out of spite. I'm interested in what it's worth. I slide a folder across the coffee table, the one my lawyer and I built over 3 careful weeks. The easement is priced at a structured royalty on corridor revenue, not a flat fee. It runs for 40 years. My underlying land, the anchor parcel itself, the piece the transit authority actually wants for the hub, isn't included in this deal at all. That's a separate negotiation, with them, not with you. And I have no intention of selling it cheap the way it was sold cheap once before. Trent's face has gone the color of old paper. This is extortion. It's a market rate, I say. You'd know that if you'd ever once checked a title before building an investor deck on top of it. He stands up so fast his chair scrapes back hard enough to leave a mark on Diane's floor. And for a second, I brace for the old fear. The flinch that used to live in me whenever Trent's temper filled a room, and it doesn't come. Because I have spent a decade learning that his temper has never once, in either lifetime, cost me anything I couldn't survive. You did this on purpose, he says. You've had this whole time. You've been sitting on this, letting you what? I ask. Build a shopping corridor on land you never bothered to check you controlled? I didn't do that part. You did that part yourselves, same as you cut me out of the will yourselves. Same as you spent a decade deciding I didn't matter enough to be careful around. I just didn't stop you. Diane's lawyer. She's brought her own, a tired-looking man named Alderson, who clearly wasn't briefed on the full history before walking in. Clears his throat and tries, gamely, to redirect things towards something resembling a negotiation. Ms. Calloway, if we could discuss the actual terms of the... It's Ashford, I say, mild. I use my mother's name now, professionally. Ms. Calloway hasn't been accurate for years. That lands harder than I expect it to in the room. A small correction that somehow says more than anything I've said so far. That I built an entire second identity, a working life, a company, under a name that has nothing to do with any of them, and that I did it a long time before this meeting was ever necessary. Trent's face does something complicated. You changed your name? I didn't change anything. I just started using the one that was already mine. I nod at my lawyer. A sharp, unhurried woman named Priya recommended 2 years earlier, and who has done nothing but earn that recommendation since. And she opens her own folder to run through the structure of the offer in the flat, patient tone of someone who's done this 100 times and isn't remotely moved by the tension in the room. The easement grants access across the northern boundary of the parcel, sufficient for the proposed entrance road and utility corridor, she says. In exchange, Marrow Holdings receives a royalty of 8% of gross corridor revenue structured over a 40-year term secured against the corridor properties themselves as collateral. The underlying anchor parcel, the acreage the Transit Authority has identified for the hub itself, is excluded from this agreement entirely and remains solely under Marrow Holdings ownership, to be negotiated separately and directly with the Transit Authority. Alderson's eyebrows go up. 8% of gross for 40 years. That's an enormous claim against the corridor's economics. Nobody structures a deal like that. Nobody usually needs to, I say. Usually people check title before they build an investor deck. Trent stands up so fast his chair scrapes back hard enough to leave a mark on Diane's floor. And for a second, I brace for the old fear. The flinch that used to live in me whenever Trent's temper filled a room. And it doesn't come, because I have spent a decade learning that his temper has never once, in either lifetime, cost me anything I couldn't survive. This is extortion, he says. It's a market rate, I say. You'd know that if you'd ever once checked a title before building an investor deck on top of it. You could have told me before I brought in 20 investors. Before I put my name on this. You could have said something at any point in the last 4 years, Wren, one word, and instead you sat there at every dinner, every party, nodding along like what you told a room full of strangers I was? I ask. And my voice, for the first time all evening, has an edge in it I don't bother softening. Somebody who inherited a hobby? You said that to me at your own investor dinner, Trent. Standing at that same bar 3 drinks in, feeling very pleased with yourself. I remember it exactly. I remember most of what either of you have said to me for the last 10 years, actually, in a level of detail that would probably surprise you. Do you want me to start reciting it back? Because I can. I have plenty of time. Nobody in the room says anything for a moment. Diane's face has gone very still. The particular stillness of someone doing quiet math about exactly how much has been overheard, remembered, filed away. I'm not going to do that, I say more quietly. It wouldn't get either of us anywhere. I'm just telling you, I could. I close the folder and stand. Because I'm not going to let this become a screaming match. That's not the ending I want. Either Lifetime's version of me has had enough screaming matches in this house to last several more. The offer's good for 30 days. After that, I talk to Kestrel and the Transit Authority directly, and you're not part of that conversation at all. Diane's voice, when it finally comes, has lost every trace of warmth. You always were a cold little thing under all that politeness. I learned it here, and I say, and I let myself smile. Just slightly, on my way to the door. Thank you for the lesson. The 30 days do not go well for them, and I hear about most of it secondhand. The way you hear about weather in a country you've already left. Kestrel's lawyers, once they understand the easement is the only viable path to a buildable corridor, push Trent hard to accept my terms rather than risk the whole project collapsing, but accepting my terms means committing 40 years of corridor revenue to a royalty structure that guts the margins Trent promised his investors. And 2 of the 3 major backers pull out within the month, spooked less by the money than by the discovery that the man running the project hadn't secured basic title on his own anchor parcel. The first backer to go is a private equity fund out of the city, whose managing partner, according to Priya's cousin's version of events, spent exactly one phone call with Kestrel's lawyers before withdrawing entirely. Not because the numbers had gotten worse, though they had, but because the discovery itself read as a character issue rather than a market one. Nobody wants to be the first investor left holding equity in a project whose lead developer built an entire pitch deck on land he'd never checked he controlled. The second backer, a family office that had committed on the strength of a personal relationship with Trent's late father rather than any real diligence of its own, pulls out more quietly, with a short letter citing a reassessment of risk exposure that everyone involved understands to mean the same thing without anyone having to say it directly. Kestrel itself, embarrassed and unwilling to eat the reputational cost, restructures the deal down to a fraction of its original footprint and quietly starts describing Trent, in rooms he isn't in, as someone they wouldn't lead with again. What's left by the time the dust settles is a corridor plan roughly a third the size of what Trent stood up and presented, under string lights and a string quartet. A single strip of retail near the highway exit, no promenade, no continuous frontage, no version of the vision that ever made it into an investor's imagination. The land at the far end up toward the ridge sits undeveloped. Its zoning approvals lapsed, worth considerably less on paper than it was worth the week before the transit announcement, because half its promised value depended on a connection to my parcel that no longer exists on any terms favorable to Trent. Diane, meanwhile, discovers what 40 years of committed royalty payments do to the resale value of everything else she inherited. The liquid assets Gerald read into the record that afternoon in the sunroom's golden light turn out to be far less liquid once half of them are tied up as collateral against a redevelopment plan that no longer has the margins it was built on. She lists the Birch Hill compound within the year, quote, not by choice from what I hear, but because Trent's investors, once they realize the corridor's revised, shrunken version won't cover what he owes them, come looking for collateral wherever they can find it, and the family compound turns out to be the easiest thing to point to. I don't sell them my anchor parcel cheap either. 6 months after the negotiation in Diane's living room, I sit across a different table. A conference room downtown this time, with the Transit Authority's acquisitions team and my own lawyer beside me, and I sell access rights to the Route 9 site for a figure that would have kept the version of me who died on an iced sidewalk fed and housed for the rest of her natural life 100 times over. I don't sell the land outright. I structure the deal so Marrow Holdings retains ownership and leases the necessary footprint to the Transit Authority on a long-term basis. Because I remember, even now, how much value gets left on the table by people who sell too early out of relief at finally being offered real money. I hear about the worst of it from Priya, actually, who has a cousin who waits tables at the country club where Diane still, out of habit, holds court on Sunday afternoons, and who reports back with a delighted horror of someone watching a soap opera unfold in real time, that Diane has stopped being invited to the small dinner parties that used to fill her calendar. Not because anyone's cruel enough to say why out loud, but because a woman whose family's flagship real estate venture just collapsed publicly enough to make the regional business section is not. Suddenly, someone people want seated near their own investments. Diane, who spent 30 years curating exactly which rooms she belonged in, finds herself uninvited from most of them within 18 months. And there is no version of this I can pretend not to feel something sharp and satisfied about, whatever that says of me. Trent's marriage doesn't survive the collapse either, though I only hear this in fragments, the way you hear about a storm that happened somewhere you used to live. Sloan, I'm told, was never particularly interested in a version of Trent that didn't come with a growing real estate empire attached to it, and once the empire started shrinking instead. Once 2 of the 3 Kestrel backers pulled out. Once the corridor plan got restructured down to a strip mall, a fraction of the size he'd promised at that glossy investor dinner, once his own mother started quietly asking her lawyer whether there was any way to claw back some of what she'd sunk into his ambitions. Sloan filed within the year and took, from what I understand, most of what remained of the goodwill anyone still extended him. The negotiation with the Transit Authority itself, separate from all of this, turns out to be the easiest conversation I have in the entire ordeal. Mostly because nobody on their side has any emotional history with me at all. I sit down with their acquisitions team 6 weeks after the meeting in Diane's living room, in a conference room downtown with a view of the river. And among the 3 people across the table is Marcus Oyalaran, older now than he was at that county planning meeting years earlier, running the environmental and land use review for the whole corridor project. He recognizes me before I have to remind him. "The zoning overlay question," he says, half smiling, shaking my hand. "You asked a sharper question about frontage easements than anyone else in that room, if I remember right. I always wondered what happened to you." "I bought some land," I say. "Turns out it mattered." He laughs, and something about the ease of it, a stranger being simply uncomplicatedly glad to see me do well, catches me more than I expect it to, after months of rooms full of people who've spent a decade deciding my successes were either accidents or threats. The negotiation itself is straightforward in a way nothing involving my family ever is. I don't sell them the land outright. I've learned that lesson too well to make that mistake twice, even in a life where I've never actually made it before. Instead, Marrow Holdings leases the necessary footprint to the Transit Authority on a 99-year term, retaining ownership of the underlying parcel and negotiating a percentage of any future commercial development the authority permits around the hub itself. The coffee kiosks, the parking structure retail, the small satellite offices that inevitably cluster around any major transit stop within a few years of it opening. It's not a number I'll say out loud to anyone outside this room, but it's enough several times over to make the studio apartment and the foreclosure counselor and the ice on that sidewalk feel like they happened to somebody else's life entirely, which in the strictest sense, I suppose they did. "We'll need the parcel clear of the existing structure," one of the acquisitions team says, meaning the collapsed equipment shed that stood on that land since before I was born. There's talk of a small commemorative marker actually once construction wraps. County likes to do that for sites with some history. "Understand your family held this land a long time." "A long time," I agree, and don't say anything else about it, because there isn't a version of the truth I could give him that would fit in a sentence, or that he'd need to hear anyway. Gerald calls me eventually, months after all of it settles, in a voice that's trying very hard to sound merely professional and not managing it entirely. "I want you to know," he says, "I had no idea when I drew up that transfer. I want you to know it wasn't intentional oversight on my part." "I know," I say, and I mean it, because Gerald was never the architect of any of this, just the pen that Diane held. You just wrote down what she told you to write down. You didn't know what it was worth, neither did she. "No," he agrees, quiet. "None of us did." There's a moment near the end of all of it that I didn't plan for and don't regret. Trent shows up at my office. Marrow Holdings has an actual office now, small, unglamorous, 3 rooms above a bakery downtown that smells like bread every morning when I unlock the door. Unannounced on a Thursday, looking like a man who's lost more sleep than his suit is designed to hide. My assistant, a sharp 23-year-old named Priya, who has heard enough of this story secondhand to know exactly who he is, doesn't let him pass the front desk without checking with me first. He says it's important, she tells me in the doorway of my office, with the particular flat tone of someone extending a professional courtesy she personally thinks is unearned. He also looks like he's about to either cry or start yelling, and I genuinely can't tell which. "Send him in," I say. "It's fine." I let him in anyway. Not because I owe him the meeting, but because I want to see with my own eyes the last version of this particular ending. He looks smaller in the doorway of my office than he ever looked in any room in the house I grew up half visiting. Not physically, but in some other way. The particular shrinkage of a man who's spent his whole life being told he was building towards something and has just discovered all at once how little of it was ever actually his. "You ruined me," he says without preamble, sitting down uninvited. "You know that? You sat there for years letting me talk about the corridor, letting me think I had it handled. And you knew this whole time what that land was going to be worth. I bought a piece of dirt nobody wanted," I say. "That's not a crime, Trent. Building a company on top of land you never checked you owned. That's not a crime either. It's just expensive. You could have told me. You could have asked." I let that sit. "Do you remember at your mother's anniversary party telling me I inherited a hobby? Do you remember telling a room full of people I was the guest? Do you remember standing next to your mother while Gerald read a will that had my name in it exactly 0 times and laughing?" He doesn't answer, which is its own answer. "I lost Sloan," he says instead, quieter now, some of the anger draining out of him and leaving something flatter and sadder behind it. I lost the compound. Mom's barely speaking to me. She blames me for the whole thing, like I built the plan alone, like she didn't sign off on every dollar of it. I don't have anywhere to go from here, Wren. I don't know how to start over. Nobody ever taught me how. For one unguarded second, something in me softens toward him. Not forgiveness exactly, but a flicker of the old tangled feeling of a sister toward a brother, even a stepbrother, even one who spent a decade making sure I understood I wasn't really either. I remember briefly, a summer we were both maybe 9 and 12, before Diane fully calcified into who she became, when he taught me to ride a bike in the driveway of the old house. Patient in a way he stopped being once his mother made clear which of us was worth patience. I'm not going to pretend I feel sorry about this. I say, and I mean it. And there's a strange lightness in meaning it. A lightness I spent years of my first life certain I'd never get to feel. You didn't lose anything I took from you. You lost something you never checked was yours to begin with. I just didn't warn you. Family doesn't do this to each other. We were never family, I say. I believed that the moment Gerald finished reading. I just took longer than you did to act like it was true. I pause and let the next part come out gentler than anything else I've said to him in years, because there's no version of victory I want that requires kicking a man while he's already on the floor. For what it's worth, I don't wish you nothing. I hope you figure out how to start over. I just don't think that's my job to teach you, not after everything. You'll have to learn it the way I did. He doesn't have anything to say to that. He sits there a moment longer, looking at his hands, and then he stands and doesn't offer to shake mine, and I don't offer either. Priya sees him out. He doesn't come back. My father's garden, the one he was looking at the last afternoon he was clear enough to tell me the truth, is still there, technically, on what used to be the Birch Hill property, though the house itself sold to a family with 2 kids and a golden retriever who have no idea what any of it costs to get to them. I drive past it sometimes, not often, and I don't feel the pull toward it I thought I might. The truth of my father was never really the house. It was one sunroom, one afternoon, one sentence I got to keep this time that I never got to keep before. Marrow Holdings has 3 employees now, and a modest but growing portfolio that has nothing to do with spite and everything to do with the same patient, unglamorous instinct that led me to 11 acres of weeds in the first place. Buy the thing nobody's looking at properly. And wait, I think sometimes about the woman who died on that iced sidewalk, the one whose whole life I'm technically still living, just further along a different road than she ever got to travel. I don't think of her as someone else exactly. She's me, all the way down. Every humiliation she absorbed is a humiliation I still carry the memory of. Every year of quiet poverty is a year I still feel in my bones when I walk past a foreclosure office downtown, which I do sometimes, on purpose, just to remind myself what the stakes actually were. But I've stopped being angry on her behalf in the way I used to be, in the early years of this second chance, when the rage still felt like the only fuel I had. What I feel now is something closer to tenderness. She didn't do anything wrong. She just didn't have what I have. A second look at the same 10 years and the particular, specific, unglamorous piece of information that turned out to be worth more than an entire inherited estate. I've thought, too, about whether I'd do any of it differently, given the choice again. And mostly I land on no, though there are edges I'd smooth if I could. I wish I hadn't needed to let Trent talk himself into a corridor plan built on land he didn't own. I wish there'd been a version of this where his recklessness cost him less than a marriage and his mother's remaining social standing. But I also remember clearly exactly how many years he spent believing I was someone he didn't have to be careful around. And I've made a kind of peace with the fact that people who build their confidence on top of other people's assumed smallness eventually have to reckon with what happens when the assumption turns out to be wrong. I didn't make him careless. I just declined to warn him. Diane, for her part, sold what remained of the Birch Hill compound eventually to cover what she could of Trent's debts and moved into a smaller place across town. The kind of tasteful, forgettable condo that used to be the sort of address she'd have found beneath her. I saw her once by accident at a grocery store, both of us reaching for the same brand of coffee, and there was a moment, brief, almost funny in its awkwardness, where neither of us knew whether to speak. She looked older than the years accounted for. I said hello. She said hello back, and something in her face for just a second looked almost like she wanted to say more. the way my father had. That afternoon in the sunroom, when he finally let the truth surface through everything that usually kept it buried. Whatever it was, she didn't say it. I didn't wait for her to. I paid for my coffee and left. And I didn't feel triumphant about it exactly, just finished. The way you feel finished with a book you've read all the way to the last page and don't need to open again. The transit hub finishes construction the spring after the negotiations close, all glass and steel rising up out of ground that used to be a punchline at family dinners. A collapsed shed, and a chain-link fence and a raccoon that, as far as I know, found somewhere else to live. Nadia comes with me to the opening because by then she's not just a friend, but Marrow Holdings' head of property operations, a title she still finds a little funny to say out loud given how the whole company started with one skeptical roof estimate. We stand near the edge of the crowd, not the center of it. I've never needed to be the center of anything. That was always Diane's hunger, not mine. And watch the county officials cut a ribbon in front of a small brass plaque that mentions, in a single understated line, that the site was formerly held by the Calloway family for several decades. No further explanation. No mention of a will, a lawyer, a dinner in gold light. Just a fact, quiet and permanent, embedded in the ground the way facts eventually are, whatever noise surrounded them on the way there. I go stand on the finished plaza on the day it opens, among strangers waiting for trains that will take them somewhere else, and I think about a gold-lit dining room and a lawyer with an apology in his face, and a sentence that used to be the worst thing I'd ever heard. "There's nothing here for you," Gerald said, twice in 2 different lives, meaning the same thing both times and understanding it neither time. I stand in the middle of what used to be nothing, what everyone in my family agreed for 30 years was nothing, and I let myself, finally without any performance in it at all, just be glad. They were wrong. There was always something here for me. I think one last time about the version of me who never got a second chance at any of this, who is, in every way that matters, still me, still the same woman, just one who ran out of road before she found the turn. I don't know why I got this and she didn't. I've stopped trying to answer that question, the way you eventually stop turning over a stone that never gives you anything new, no matter how many times you lift it. What I know instead is simpler, and it's the only thing I actually need to know, that the 10 years I was handed a second time weren't wasted, not one of them. Not the humiliations I let land without flinching. Not the years of quiet patience. Not the small, unglamorous work of learning to fix a roof and read a lease and sit across a table from people who'd already decided I didn't matter, and let them keep believing it until the moment it was too late for the belief to help them. It just took them leaving me out of the will for me to go and get it myself.